Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong. I'm your host, Chad D, and it feels like a minute since I've last said that phrase, because it has been. And you know what? Sometimes you have to take a break, and I needed a break this month of May, if that is when you're listening to this episode. But breaks are important. But there's a big but. During the few week break that I have had, I have continued to record episodes that are super important. The conversations are timely, and that leads us to today's episode, where I'm joined by two powerhouse legal minds from the Rewire News Group, the only national nonprofit newsroom exclusively dedicated to expert reporting on reproductive and sexual health rights and justice. Imani and Gandy is Rewire's executive producer of legal content and culture, and Jessica Pieklo is their executive producer of legal content and advocacy, and together they co-host the pioneering legal podcast called Boom Lawyered. And Imani also hosts her own podcast called Bitch Listen. Today, we are unpacking one of the most consequential Supreme Court terms in recent memory. From the ongoing fight over mifepristone access to legal threats to birthright citizenship to what Louisiana's Supreme Court case means for the future of voting rights, we discuss it all. And so without further ado, I give you my conversation with Imani and Jess. Jess and Imani, thank you so much for joining me today. This is such a treat. I never really have two guests on at one time, so this is going to be fun. I'm so excited. We're going to unpack everything that's related to the Supreme Court and what's been happening in the past few weeks as it relates to their court cases, from mifepristone to the Voting Rights Act. We have a lot to cover, but I first want to ask, how are you both doing?
I mean, I guess this is Jess Pieklo. Thank you so much for having us on. I'm as good as anybody can be in the current moment, but excited as always to have an opportunity to chat about some really important topics with one of my favorite people on the planet, Imani Gandy.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I'm doing all right, hanging in there, pretty irritated about this $1.776 billion fund that Trump is using to pay off basically neo-Confederates. But aside from that, I'm great.
That I feel you on that one. That fund is what got some people in Alabama to vote Democratic for the first time. So you know what? The way I view it is, I'm like, keep doing it. Keep doing it.
Yeah,
Just keep
doing
going. Show your
things.
true colors. If that's what it's going to take for people to switch their vote and realize how corrupt and awful this administration is, how they're using the administration for their own personal benefit at our detriment, keep doing it. Just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can really appreciate that. But I do, I understand why folks who have been traditionally Republican, generationally Republican, often something like the slush fund for insurrectionists could be a last straw, because it is, this administration is excellent at wrecking norms, but this is really one that sort of takes on everything about what we like to, particularly white Americans, tell ourselves is good and true about the values and institutions of this country. And it just takes it right in, punches it square in the teeth. And people definitely saw law enforcement officers be assaulted, have died, and we're supposed to, reward that. We know for a fact that there were people who were harassing abortion patients and providers who were part of that January 6th insurrection, who Trump has not only pardoned, but now will probably file claims against that. It should just make everybody's stomach turn.
Yeah.
Particularly when, people are struggling with the price of groceries. I mean, I go to the grocery store and I cannot believe how expensive things are. And so the idea that, I filed my taxes on time this year for the first time ever. I did them myself, I filed them on time, I paid them on time, and I was proud of that.
Yeah.
But the idea that people's tax money, the money that we give to the government, is going to people who tried to overthrow the government, in essence, right? These people who were attacking law enforcement officers, who were attacking members of Congress. The idea that I have to pay those people really bothers me. And it probably bothers a lot of people who otherwise may not be particularly political.
We all knew that the Trump administration, his family, the people he surrounds himself with, they're out of touch in every possible way. But yet somehow his followers still like to act like, no, but he understands, he gets it. This
Yeah.
after what we saw with SNAP benefits at the end of last year, the rise in affordability that we have seen happen this year, just even here in Birmingham, Alabama, I bought a new car a year ago because it was taking $65 to fill up my car. So I bought a
Yep.
car that took about $25-$30 to fill up my tank. It is now $65 for me to fill up my car. So it's just like their lack of ability to read the room, to actually understand, is like, it's mind blowing. I did not even think that their ability to not to be that out of touch was even possible. And then here we are.
It's really astonishing. And I mean, I think, some of that group think that had kept many of the real, true, loyal Trump supporters
Yeah.
in line is starting to fray with the extreme wealth and grift that
Yeah.
that is going on with the administration. I do think that like Gilded Age touch is a little too far, to your point, where gas is $5 a gallon, and it takes a lot of money to drive your kids to and from school, and to get yourself to and from a job. And, the impacts that this is going to have on farming communities in terms of the cost of fertilizer, and how is that looking for farm or for, commodities and food prices later on. I mean, I grew up in Nebraska. These are conversations that people in my hometown and my communities are having. One of the meat packing facilities in Western Nebraska completely shut down. Tyson pulled out, and it was twofold. It was, Trump economic policies in terms of, the landscape, and then also immigration crackdown. And, they're like, well, I guess we don't have any pork now, is basically how it goes. And so I think it's going to be a long summer. And what I'm hoping, to your point, is, I know we'll be talking about the Supreme Court eventually, but that the administration, it's not good for us emotionally and financially, all of this overreach, but I do think it is having the effect of starting to wake up folks who were otherwise, kind of fingers in the ear saying, la, 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 seems fine, I'll get mine eventually. And I think it's clear to folks, nobody's getting a Trump check. That $4,000 from Doge isn't coming to any of us. It's not here. They've moved on, right? So yeah.
And just another thing to add to that, just the extreme tariff policy that went on in the first year of his presidency, and then the Supreme Court struck down basically that policy. And so now there's some restitution reimbursement, scheme, which means the corporations that paid these tariffs are going to get money back, but they pass that cost on to consumers. So why aren't consumers getting money back? And I'd be willing to bet everything I own that corporations aren't going to lower the prices now that the tariffs have gone, right? So we're still paying extra for everything. And I was forced to buy things that I need for my house that I otherwise would have waited for, because I knew the tariffs were going to make, for example, my new HVAC system that I desperately needed cost several $1,000s more than it had to. And that's frustrating for people who are just trying to put food on their table and, take care of their families.
We are going to get to the Supreme Court in just a second, but a lot of questions that I received this week before people headed to the polls for the Alabama primaries, as it relates to that fund that Trump put our taxpayer dollars into to pay those insurrectionists and his cronies and allies. One of the big questions that a lot of people were saying was like, there's something that can be done, right? Like the courts are going to step in. And I'm like, no, when you remove everyone from government, when you clear out these agencies and these oversight bodies, like this is what you get. Like this is what people were warning about when the Trump administration was going to be like before the election in 2024. This is what we were warning about, and we're seeing it. So to those people, when they ask, like, there has to be something that can be done, or the court's going to step in, what is your response to that? And Jess, I'll start with you on that one.
Great question. I think a couple things. One, there's already been a lawsuit filed by some former Capitol Police officers challenging the fund itself. But before we get into what the courts can and can't do, I think to put a finer point on what the administration can do in the meantime is important also, because what this, slush fund and this purported deal with the IRS as well, because we're talking about these two things hand in hand. What they're doing is creating pipelines for wealth transfer and insulation for folks.
Yeah.
So Trump and his family now can't be audited. They can't be held accountable for any financial crimes of corruption, in particular double dealing, while Trump has been president. That's a huge deal, because you know what? The IRS comes after folks like us all the time. And so now he's made sure that folks can't get that. The way that the fund is set up and how it would be administered does absolutely provide the administration the ability to just take that out of taxpayers' funds if there are in some kind of collections proceeding. So folks should be alarmed about that. Like, they do really, truly, in everything we've said, intend to transfer wealth this way. So now that I've said that, what can the courts do about it? Well, the courts are very conservative in terms of judicial appointees right now. And so what we've seen is many of them are willing to rubber stamp Trump policies. Not all of them, but many of them. But the litigation is still important because it can buy us time, and time creates opportunities for political and other answers to develop as well. And it's important that people feel like they're fighting. So it's not that it's not worth it or that the courts can't do anything, but hold your expectations in terms of like one judicial ruling that says, no, this isn't going to happen. Also, because this administration has a very long and well-documented history of ignoring court orders that they disagree with and that they don't like. And so even if a court tries to hold this administration accountable, we have a lot of evidence that they're just going to ignore that court.
And I would add that because the courts are so jam-packed, the dockets are so full, that litigation takes a long time.
Yes.
So there is a world in which litigation over this slush fund ends up taking until January 2029, right? And the fund is set to expire, by the end of his term. So there is a world where, there's an injunction, maybe Trump pays attention to it, maybe not. But this is such an enormous amount of money that I think it's going to be difficult to have a public conversation and to get the public on his side. So to the extent, any litigant draws a Obama appointee, for example, that the injunction goes into place, and then maybe everything is just on hold. Right. And maybe that takes 2 years, and that's good for people who oppose this sort of corruption, because it's just it's the corruption. It's just I can't even really form words to describe how corrupt this is. And the fact that, Todd Blanche is the guy the attorney general is the guy in charge of this slush fund, but he reports to Trump, right? So really it's Trump deciding who gets this money, and he could decide not to give it to anybody. Maybe he pockets the whole $1 billion.
Oh, I mean, God.
I'm sure that's what he did with that peace council, right? That he developed where, in response to the UN, where the UN Security Council, where it's like him and Viktor Orban and Putin and all of these terrible people who paid $1 billion to be on this council. What's going on?
You know what?
With
That's so valid, because you have not heard anything. It's been silent since then. Yeah, it's in their bank accounts. It's in their bank accounts. You brought up a really valid point with how crowded the courts are getting with these cases that are coming before them. And I want to transition into talking about mifepristone for a moment, and I want to get this right, because the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a ruling about a ruling staying the FDA's updated safety guidelines that allowed mifepristone to be prescribed via telehealth and mailed to patients. And then Justice Alito temporarily blocked that ruling, and then it goes back to the lower courts. And that seems to be happening with so many things that's going before the court. A circuit court's ruling on something, it goes to the Supreme Court, it goes back to the lower courts, and then you hear about another case in the news, and it's just so much being thrown at us, and it's just very confusing. If y'all had to talk about why that's happening, what that process is that by design, that confusion with how it's just working through the court system? Is it designed to confuse us, or is that like the best outcome for what's going on?
I'm going to let Jess take this after I say one thing. It is purposefully chaotic, and Jess loves to talk about that. So I'm going to let her handle that. but also that's just sort of the way litigation works sometimes, right? A lot of times these cases, you file a lawsuit and you ask for an injunction, and then there's a whole hearing on whether or not you should get an injunction. And an
Yep.
injunction just says, we need to block this whatever it is, whatever order it is, maintain the status quo so that we can then go on and litigate the actual merits of the case, like the underlying merits. Is mifepristone safe to be prescribed remotely? Is the 2000 authorization, was that exceeding the FDA's authority, which is what Texas is arguing in a separate case. So it's just the procedural posture of the case that makes it seem confusing, and the way that the Supreme Court will step in on an injunction where it's not the merits and make a sort of merits-based ruling, right? So they make a ruling that sort of signals what they're going to do when they actually get the case for real, so to speak, right? So it is confusing. It's confusing to lawyers. So of course it's confusing to people who had the God-given sense not to go to law school. And so that's what Jess and I try to do a lot, is explain how the courts work, why they aren't working for regular people. They're mostly working for big business and conservatives, and how the chaos is sort of built into the system. And you have conservatives exploiting that chaos by filing cases in jurisdictions where they have no business filing cases. Everyone wants to file a case in either the Western District of Texas or the Northern District of Texas, because those two judges, Matt Kaczmarek and Reed O'Connor, are extremely conservative and will rubber stamp anything that the Republicans want to do. So then you have to have conversations about, are the cases in the right jurisdiction? Are the plaintiffs the right plaintiffs, right? Like if you want to talk about the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine case, which is the case last term about whether or not this coalition of Christian doctors and dentists, as we like to point out, because there were dentists who were part of this plaintiff group who were arguing that mifepristone is so dangerous that somehow, and I don't know who's going to dentists for medical care, but somehow these doctors and dentists were having basically their feelings hurt because maybe they're the only person in the ER when someone with a complication from medication abortion comes in, and they have to finish the abortion despite their reservations, right? And so you have these plaintiffs who are making these claims, and the courts are saying those are BS claims, right? Like you don't have an injury sufficient enough to come to this court and ask us to do something on mifepristone. So we really still haven't gotten from the court a ruling about the safety of mifepristone, the safety of remote dispensation, the safety of the original authorization in the first place.
I want to take this question on and reframe it, because I think what folks are starting to understand is, for the first time, is that the federal courts are a political body and they are political actors. And that is not what you learned in civics class. That is not what people learned in their introduction to government classes. The federal courts are supposed to be neutral arbiters of the law. And we've seen a shift in the last 30 to 40 years, really, where judicial appointments in particular became hyperly politicized. And this was primarily started under the Obama administration. And then, the sort of cascading result of the failure to seat Merrick Garland when he was nominated, all the way through the manner in which Amy Coney Barrett's nomination was handled by the Trump administration when Justice Ginsburg was still lying in state. Like the shift from the federal courts as a place where disputes are decided to a place where policy is crafted is very real. And the point that you were making around the confusion is part of that design in the shift, because in the olden days, as it used to be, there was a very clear process and procedure for how the court took cases, and when I say the court, I'm talking about the Supreme Court here, but how the Supreme Court decided to take a case, when it took a case, and what it would do with that case when it did. And then the Supreme Court became stacked with judges who were loyal to the Federalist Society and not the U.S. Constitution. And we saw an explosion of activity around what we call the shadow docket. And the shadow docket is where the court does business behind the scenes. Normally, the court has oral arguments in a case, and there's briefing, and there's a long time of deliberation before a decision is made. The Supreme Court doesn't do business like that anymore. The Supreme Court now does business twofold, in the traditional manner and also on the shadow docket. So what happened most recently with mifepristone was more or less all shadow docket action. To Imani's point, there was never a conversation in the lower courts about the substance of any of the claims Louisiana is making. When lawyers talk about the merits, that's really the substance, right? The meat and potatoes of what they're arguing before the judge. It just went straight up because the Louisiana Attorney General didn't like the outcome, and the conservative legal movement has been primed to know that the Roberts Court is ready and willing to take up their grievance issues on the shadow docket if they can. Sam Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas in the mifepristone, the abortion pill case, both filed dissenting opinions to an order which just keeps abortion access status quo. It didn't make it more available. It didn't make it less available. It just kept it the same, which is how the courts should and normally do operate. That there should be nothing remarkable about what happened at the Supreme Court, except the fact that we're having this conversation right now at all without any of the underlying litigation actually taking place. And so that, as an analyst, is a tell. That tells me that this is a political fight and not a legal one. And that's how I want folks who are newer to these conversations and are starting to see, my goodness, what is the Supreme Court doing right now? And why does it feel so crazy? Because it is. It is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to jump in and explain, Jess mentioned the Federalist Society and the fact that these conservatives are beholden to the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is a multi-million-dollar, basically dark money group led by a man named Leonard Leo, who has a stranglehold over the federal judiciary. And that is because of one of the Supreme Court justices in the olden days named David Souter, who was appointed by a Republican and then proceeded to vote pretty much with the liberals on all the cases that sort of matter to people. And conservatives said to themselves, well, we're not going to let that happen again. When we put a judge on the bench, we want to know how that judge is going to rule. So yeah, we'll go through the rigmarole of confirmation hearings, and the judges will all say what they have to say. Back when Roe versus Wade was still good law, everyone wanted to know, what's your opinion on Roe versus Wade? And every judge says, well, it's settled precedent. I believe it's settled precedent, and that's it. And, people who pay attention to these things knew at the time that they were lying, because they are not beholden to settled precedent the way that they used to be. And that's because the Federalist Society is a very, very powerful conservative group for lawyers. They get these conservative lawyers in law school, right? They pick up these lawyers from conservative groups. They take them to nice dinners, to conferences. They breed them. They put them in Supreme Court clerkships. And so by the time they're ready to enter the world and practice law, they've already been taught a specific ideology, and they've already been picked because they believe in that specific ideology. So there's a reason why for a while on our podcast, Jess and I were calling the 6 conservatives on the court the FedSoc 6, right? The Federalist Society 6, because they all think the same. Their jurisprudence is almost entirely the same. And sure, every once in a while, Neil Gorsuch may go rogue on issues relating to Native Americans because he's very good on those issues. And sure, maybe he'll issue an opinion like he did in the Bostock case, where he said Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which says employers cannot discriminate against employees on the basis of race, sex, national origin, etc. Neil Gorsuch said, yeah, that includes trans people. Like, sometimes we'll get a little bit of a glimmer of like humanity from these people, but then it's almost always snatched back, like in the next case that has to do with that issue. So, I think Jess's point is really, really critical. People need to understand that it's a political body, and that the Supreme Court, sometimes they're not even paying attention to what the courts of appeal do, right? They'll just jump right in before a court of appeal has a chance to say anything, because that's how political this body is.
I hate it here. I hate it here. No, okay. This is like a bit off script, but it has my mind thinking like, is there no remedy? Is there no like, can Supreme Court justices be impeached if they're lying in these Senate hearings? Is there no remedy to that lie? And I'm also thinking you have these cases that are going up saying like mifepristone is flawed. There's no data on it. It's not safe. It's going to kill women. When we have decades of data, we
Right.
know that's a lie. They're going before a court lying. Like, why can't they be held accountable for that?
So there should be mechanisms, and there are, right? Yes, Supreme Court justices, all federal court judges, they can go through an impeachment process. We saw that with Trump, though that requires political will,
Yep.
and particularly lawyers they believe deeply in the institution, in a way that I think is, getting in their own way sometimes. But we do have lots of avenues and change. And I'll pass the mic over to Imani in a second on this, because I know this is something that she really loves to talk about. But if we are thinking of the federal courts as a political body, then we understand that there are structural and electoral changes that can happen for that. For example, Congress funds the federal courts. So Congress has the ability to start to use the power of the purse to redirect things. And then we have the power as voters and members of the electorate to demand structural change into how the federal courts and the Supreme Court operates. We can demand court reform. And that's where I'm going to let Imani jump in.
My favorite topic, court reform. And the funny part is it's my favorite topic because of a particular plan that a legal analyst, Elie Mystal, has put forth several times. You've probably seen him on MSNBC, black guy, big gray fro, hugely, just wildly intelligent. And he has a plan that I think people think he's being provocative or sort of silly when he puts it forth. But if you actually think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So right now we have these 9 judges, these 9 justices, right? 9 unelected people, 6 of whom are all Federalist Society attached in some way. And so they all think the same. For the most part, they think the same. They have the same jurisprudential principles. And when there's a case involving human rights, civil rights, we know how they're going to rule. So Ellie's plan is let's increase the number of justices on the court to like 20, right? And in order to get Republicans on board for such a plan, we'll let them even have 3 more conservative judges than liberal judges. But what this does is it breaks up this singularity of thought among conservatives.
Yes.
Because if you are a conservative justice and you want to, for example, say that mifepristone, a drug that has been authorized and safe for 25 years, should be taken off the market for some nonsense reasons that literally don't make any sense, then you need to find 14 other justices on the bench to agree with you. And if you've ever had to sit in a room with 14 lawyers and try to get them to agree on anything, it is very difficult, right? So I think we are so beholden to this idea that we need to have these 9 people, but it doesn't say there needs to be 9 people anywhere in the Constitution. Jess, I see you want to jump in, so I'm going to let you do
Oh,
that.
no, I was going to say the only reason we have 9 people is because we have not expanded the size of the Supreme Court bench. It used to be that, and I mean, the number of justices reflected the number of appellate circuits in the country. So appellate circuits are that intermediate area of review that a case goes through. You file a case in district court and you file an appeal. That's the appellate circuit. So we have 9 judges or justices on the Supreme Court because we used to have 9 appellate circuits. We now have 13 plus some military tribunals and some others. We could at least expand to 13, and that would just be parity. It would be equal with what we're seeing in the structure of the court as it already exists. And and we also know that the court can operate with less because the court operated with 8 justices for a year while they upheld Merrick Garland's nomination and carried it over to a different administration. So we know we have recent historical precedent for the court operating at different levels of staffing. Just expand it, put more people on.
Also, Jess knows I'm going to go there. Why does the Supreme Court get to even review acts of Congress, right? Congress passes legislation. And right now, with this court, there is nothing progressive that Democrats can do to pass legislation that will survive review at the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So then you have to ask yourself, why does the Supreme Court even get to legislate, to rule on congressional legislation? Why does the court get to decide whether or not acts of Congress comport with the Constitution? And I'm going to give you the answer to that question, and it might blow your mind. It's because the Supreme Court decided it wanted to. Back in 1803, there was a case called Marbury versus Madison. And it is the first case that all first-year law school students in constitutional law class read, because it established the principle that the Supreme Court can review acts of Congress and say, you know what, Congress, this goes too far. We're going to strike it down. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the Supreme Court the right to do that. So honestly, if you want to talk about power grabs, the Supreme Court grabbed so much power right out of the gate, and we've just lived with it. People aren't questioning it. And the reason that people haven't been questioning it is because the person who wrote that decision, an old guy named John Marshall, he believed in deferring to Congress. So he thought it was necessary for the Supreme Court, as the interpreter of the Constitution, to be able to say to Congress, hey, this is not constitutional. We're going to strike that down. But if Congress had good reason to do what they did with that legislation, John Marshall and the court in 1803 would just defer to them. We don't have those kinds of justices now. There is no deference to Congress. The Supreme Court is grabbing Congress's power left and right. And of course, we have a Congress that's letting them, so that doesn't help either.
Yeah.
But I think I really would love your listeners to take away from this conversation that there is nothing in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court has the right to strike down the Voting Rights Act. And Congress could decide, some future Congress that's like, you know what? We're balling, right? We're going out of control. We're going to do this. Some future Congress could decide, you know what? We are going to restrict your jurisdiction. We are going to restrict the realm of cases that you, the Supreme Court, are allowed to hear and decide upon. And those cases no longer include legislation that we pass. That could be done.
We could protect voting rights from Supreme Court review the same way that the Trump administration and Trump himself has protected he and his family from legal review from the IRS. It's a straight parallel.
That part.
Yeah.
We're going to get into the Voting Rights Act in just a minute, because I think Alabama, at yet another point in our history, is at the center of so much. But I want to keep it on mifepristone for just a second, because like we already laid out, we know it's safe, we know it's effective, we have decades of data on it. But say the courts end up blocking it, banning it, it is no longer accessible via telehealth. Who are they targeting with these decisions? Because what we know is, in places like Alabama, there are healthcare deserts. There are stretches of 2 to 3 hours in any direction where you just don't have access to any hospital. So, and for a lot of people, a lot of low income families and a lot of these healthcare deserts, telehealth literally is someone's only access to healthcare. And they most likely are going to be the ones to first feel the effects of decisions like this. So when we see the courts and the Supreme Court making these decisions, like, who are they actually targeting with what's going on?
Let me talk to Alabamians in particular on this, because, you have one of the most abortion restricted states in the country already. And so what happens when the Supreme Court endorses any kind of abortion ban? Well, for Alabamians, it means that any pregnancy that doesn't deliver a healthy baby to the state is automatically filed under probable cause for a potential crime. And so what we let folks know is that the risks around medication abortion and self-managed abortion, which is how folks in the South, where telehealth is already banned, where abortion is largely banned, they would be doing this sort of outside of the bounds of the law. Self-managed abortion itself in those jurisdictions is not a crime. However, conservatives have done a very good job of scaffolding other acts that you could fall under. So the risk to folks is not medical, it's legal. And they should know that first and foremost. But what it really is an attack on the relationship between yourself and your medical provider in any capacity. Because the other things we've seen with abortion bans is that they are never related just to abortion. They leak into other areas of reproductive health care and autonomy. So mifepristone, for example, the pill that we're talking about right now, the medication that we're talking about, it's part of a two medication regime in the United States for managing early pregnancy termination. That includes missed miscarriages. So Alabamians, if you are in the middle of a miscarriage, you could find yourself in medical risk and having to travel, to your point, with gas at $5 a gallon right now, to somewhere where hopefully an emergency team is not going to turn you away because they have a religious objection to terminating a pregnancy and suspect that you have maybe done something to induce this miscarriage. It's a nightmare of state surveillance for folks who genuinely also want to have children and to raise families. There's a lawsuit in Arkansas right now that very much puts this narrative front and center for it. And one of the plaintiffs is a man. And he's the father in this family and watched his wife go through medical induced trauma that was entirely avoidable as a result of Arkansas's ban. And he describes very eloquently the pain on his family, the pain for himself, like the shame that as a Baptist he was covered in trying to navigate this, and how he felt failed by Republicans and conservatives because this was a wanted pregnancy. So when courts, whatever the court, politicians are making these kinds of calls on who can have access to medication and when, know that it's never going to end with abortion. It's always going to be about some kind of healthcare that they don't like.
Just to jump on that in terms of talking to Alabamians, you need to be very concerned about what you say and to whom you say it when you go to a hospital if you're having a pregnancy complication.
Yes.
You don't, and normally when you go to a hospital, you go to the doctor, you want to be as truthful as possible because any information that you leave out might affect your care, right? But when it comes to miscarriages, when it comes to self-managed abortions, if a nurse, for example, suspects that you've taken mifepristone or that you've done something else to induce a miscarriage, there is a very good chance that that nurse is going to call the police. And so you will find yourself in a situation where you're in a hospital bed and there are cops in your hospital room asking you questions, going through your phone, trying to figure out what Google searches you were using in an effort to criminalize you. So you just need to be careful about what you say, who you say it to. If you are trying to access abortion care, don't use your phone. Use a VPN. There are ways that you can protect yourself. Go incognito mode on Google. There are ways that you can sort of limit the points of access that you have with the state. And in terms of points of access with the state, this affects Black and brown women and people capable of becoming pregnant more than it affects, and also low income white people, right? But these are the people who are more likely to avail themselves of social programs such that they might have to go and do a meeting with the social worker because they have to meet with a social worker once a week for whatever reason, right? We know that when it comes to state surveillance, they are surveilling poor people, they are surveilling Black and brown people. They're not surveilling middle class, upper middle class white folks, right? Those are the people who are always going to be able to get the care that they need. This stuff really affects like the most vulnerable among us. And so if that describes you, I would encourage you to be very careful about how you go about navigating your own reproductive autonomy, which sounds ridiculous, right? You should be able to do what you want with your body, but that's not the case in places like Alabama. So you really have to be careful.
Are there any resources or places that people can go that y'all are aware of that can like inform someone on how to learn how to trust a doctor or a nurse or what to look for and not sharing information with this person? I'm genuinely, I'm like, let me post that shit out everywhere.
Pregnancy justice. Yeah. Pregnancy justice is one organization that really does an excellent job in not only connecting folks with resources that they need, but really laying out the landscape and that relationship between a pregnancy and the state. And then, as Imani said, if, when, how. They are and that's if/when/how. They do offer legal representation and advice. They have a legal helpline that folks can call ahead of time that says, hey, I am pregnant and I have an upcoming prenatal visit and I'm concerned about X, Y, and Z. Because of, to Imani's point, well before Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court, we had instances of particularly Black, brown, and low-income white women getting brought into the criminal justice system as a result of having, quote unquote, failed pregnancies, and prosecutors looking for other means to hold them responsible for not delivering a healthy baby to the state. I'm saying that again because that's really what conservatives are demanding of women and people who have the capacity to get pregnant and give birth when it comes to our reproductive capacity.
Right. I mean, what's really so alarming, particularly in a country that doesn't have parental leave, national parental leave, right? That doesn't have universal health care. There are states that are forcing people to have babies that they don't necessarily want to have. So really you are just a carrier for the state's baby.
Yes.
But you're not getting paid by the state. You're not getting any monetary help from the state to carry that child. I mean, I've never had a child, but when I talk to people who've had children and I find out how expensive it is just to have a kid, just to be in the hospital and have the child, not even counting what happens when you leave the hospital and you have to pay for diapers and formula and whatever. It's incredibly, incredibly expensive. And so then when you get cases like there was the woman in Georgia who was brain dead, who was being kept alive on life support because the state thought there was a viable fetus inside her, that's a months-long hospital stay. Who's paying for that? Not the state that is forcing her to have that child. They're expecting the parent. In this case, the person she was not alive, she was brain dead. So they're expecting her state. So that becomes her family is on the hook for these costs. It's really unreasonable, particularly when anti-choicers try to liken those kinds of situations to international situations, right? I did an article about this. There are cases in Brazil where a woman who was essentially brain dead, they were kept on life support and they were able to deliver a viable fetus. It was one of the very rare cases that is true. But in Brazil paid for all of it, right? So it's just, we're putting the squeeze to already vulnerable people. The number of people that get pushed into poverty because of unwanted pregnancies is alarming. And when you talk about social programs and the ways in which they're being cut left, right, and center. I mean, you mentioned SNAP benefits earlier. It's nearly impossible to raise a child and to try to pull yourself out of poverty at the same time.
It is near impossible. I'm at a loss for words because my brain is going in like 50 billion different directions. I had Rebecca Kelleher. She came on to my podcast a few months ago, and she was talking about how all of this is about control. It's about control. And then my brain is also going to thinking about Elon Musk's tweets recently about I know he should be a banned topic from all podcasts, but it's worth it's worth bringing up all of his tweets about America's birth rates and our population. And so I'm also thinking like it's about control. Republicans, are they trying to like groom their next voting base? Is it about America's standing with population numbers as it relates to other countries? I'm like, what is the why behind this? Because it's not about pro-life. It's not about Christian values. We know that. Like, why? Like, what do they gain to benefit from it?
It's a eugenics project. And we need to say that very, very clearly. So the whole birth rate, we'll get to birthrights in a minute, maybe. But birth rate panic is pronatalist eugenics project. And we can break it down very clearly. And we'll use Elon Musk as an example. He is not concerned about everybody's birth rates. He is concerned about the birth rates for a particular demographic, and that demographic is largely wealthy white folks. Why are largely wealthy white folks having less children? Well, because wealthy upper middle class white women have access to things like education and contraception, which have allowed us to have families when we want them, if we want them, and at the rate we choose to have them. It allows us to enter in and out of the economic marketplace. It allows us to decide if we are getting married in a traditional sense at all. And so what we are not hearing about are birth rate panics for anybody else. And what we are seeing is an implementation of policies that would funnel the children of certain populations into achievement spaces, and others, i.e. Black and brown families and women, into carceral systems, into prison systems, into punishment systems, into labor systems. Yep. They're explicit about this. The CEO of Palantir declared that educated liberal white women are a catastrophic threat to the future as he sees it. Why is that? Because I'll identify myself in that cohort, because we don't vote and are not value aligned with the future that these tech billionaires who are deeply ingrained and aligned with the Trump administration are putting out there. The data farms aren't in Mill Valley, California, right? These centers are in Black and brown communities that are destroying the climate. This is all by design.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be we talked about a school to prison pipeline, and now it's literally a womb to prison pipeline.
Yes.
I mean, I always have said, they are not concerned about Black and brown birth rates.
No.
And so a lot of the abortion bans pre-Dobbs, pre the case that overturned Roe, these abortion bans were built on the backs of Black and brown people, right? That's why you would have billboards in Alabama and Georgia saying the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb, right? They were targeting Black women for stigma and for shame, saying you're basically helping commit race suicide. They don't care about the number of Black people in this country. They were using Black women as a way to implement these abortion bans. And by implementing these abortion bans, they're getting the actual people that they want to be having children, as Jess said, wealthy white women. Those people are going to be having more children. Now, of course, some of them are still going to be able to get care, but by and large, that's the plan. And so people would say, well, if people would ask me on social media, back on Twitter, before Twitter became what it is now, well, if you're banning abortion, then that means you're going to have more Black and brown babies because the Black and brown birth rate is so high. And that's part of the problem, right? The part of the problem that Elon Musk sees. Well, what do you do with those kids? A, you throw them into foster care. B, you put them in families with white evangelicals so that they can be brought up in a white evangelical household. Or C, you just shove them in prison as soon as you can. Right. Yeah. And you help that engine of the economy. So it's a very insidious practice. It's a very insidious policy that seems counterintuitive until you look at it from a lens of anti-Blackness,
Hmm.
anti-immigrant, anti, I'm going to say woke white people,
Sure.
right? Like the
Sure.
fact that, these tech billionaires are so scared, so concerned with the, for example, Renee Goods of the world, right? There's a reason that they killed Renee Good and then dragged her name through the mud because she's not the type of white woman that these conservatives think should be representative of white people,
Mm.
right? It's just, it's a very, once you just look at it through that particular lens, they want more white folks. They are concerned about the black and brown birth rate, then everything sort of starts to make sense.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have a really great example of this too. And that is the rise before even, the existence of RFK Jr. at running health and human services and sort of the Make America Healthy movement again. On social media, it became very clear that something was going on because what we saw was a real shift in the way that young white women in particular were talking about two things, and that was hormonal birth control and feminism. And we saw this, what I would, and like other sort of analysts would call a pre-rhetoric campaign to undermine the benefits of autonomy, right? To criticize feminism structurally, and then to question the safety and the efficacy, the effectiveness of hormonal birth control, in particular the pill. And this is done to sort of prime people for suspicion around that. We know how these kinds of rhetorical campaigns are designed to move attention and move the conversation. Why is that happening at a time, when we have the impacts of the Dobbs decision? We have attacks on voting rights. And the message isn't that capitalism has failed you, that if you're a young woman working in, your first job and you are struggling to make ends meet, that's a function of corporate wage theft and not a failure of structural feminism. Plenty to critique feminism about. But what we're seeing is that the conservatives are very good at redirecting the messaging. So
Yes.
now the problem is that feminism has failed you and that your birth control is making you crazy. When in reality, autonomy and the ability to pay your bills and decide when and how you have kids is making you free.
I want to hit on what you just said about reframing the message and autonomy, because we just saw with the Supreme Court and the Louisiana case and the Voting Rights Act, they're reframing all of that. They're reframing the messaging around that, and in a way, they're removing our autonomy from making decisions for ourselves. They're telling us who our representatives are going to be in these. So I just want to ask y'all to unpack quickly that Louisiana case, and then we're going to bring it to Alabama because Alabama's right now at the center of it. But I just about reframing the messaging, the Republicans and how they're attacking the Voting Rights Act and how we're losing our autonomy through it.
Yeah, I mean, the reframe that has been ongoing for years now is that racial gerrymandering has absolutely nothing to do with partisan gerrymandering, and that it is completely normal and acceptable and constitutional for each party to gerrymander their districts, to draw their districts in such a way that they can maintain their stranglehold on the
Yep.
state. And obviously in the southern state, this is Republicans, right? So the idea
Yep.
is that and the Supreme Court has said partisan gerrymandering is fine. So Republicans are permitted to redistrict to ensure that Republicans get sent to Congress, to ensure that Republican incumbents get sent to Congress again. And so when you start to bring up race, when you start to talk about how the majority of Black people in the South vote for Democrats, then it becomes, well, isn't it racist to
Yep.
say that all Black people vote for Democrats and only white people vote for Republicans? That sounds racist. It's not racist, it's reality.
Yep.
There's a reality about the needs of Black and brown and low income and immigrant communities that is not being met by Republicans. And you can tell, I mean, the fact that the Supreme Court in Louisiana v. Callais gutted Section 2, basically just said Section 2 doesn't exist. Section 2 is the section that says, you can't discriminate in voting on the basis of race. They gutted that through saying that, well, partisan gerrymandering is okay. And the fact that most Black people vote for Democrats is just coincidence, right? It's just a coincidence. And so what did you see? Almost immediately, so many Southern states went to redistrict Black people out of power. In Tennessee.
Went to great lengths too. They spent millions of taxpayer dollars to do so.
Absolutely. They took Memphis and sprinkled all the Black folks in Memphis across other white districts, right? And if you want to bring it to Alabama, there was a case 3 years ago that was almost exactly the same as Louisiana v. Callais. That case was called Allen versus Milligan, where Alabama was required to draw a second majority Black district. We're not talking about saying, okay, all the districts have to be Black. It's just that a state that has a third of the population is Black, they should maybe have a second majority Black district. And the map drawers drew a district. They looked at race in drawing the district because that makes sense. How can you draw a majority Black district without finding out where all the Black people live? Sam Alito seems to think that in and of itself is racist. And when you move from Allen versus Milligan, that case was just about Section 2. Louisiana v. Callais saw white voters challenging Section 2 under the Equal Protection Clause, saying it is racist to take race into account to remedy racism. And that's just a bizarre proposition. But here we are, right? We're living in a reality where apparently definitely partisan gerrymandering is fine. And apparently it's just a coincidence that so many Southern Black people vote for Democrats.
I just want to say real quickly that Milligan case is being retried right now about 1 mile behind that window, behind the curtain behind me. So it's very relevant because they're literally still fighting a decision that was made 3 years ago. They're using this Louisiana case as a basis to revisit these decisions that, I can't wrap my mind around how quickly all of this is going on because our legislative session ended. The Louisiana decision happened. And then the next day, KIV said, call in a special session next week. And then you saw everything that went on in Montgomery with the All Roads Lead to the South rally. And one thing I just want to point out, and this is, again, the fourth episode where I've pointed this out, but it cannot be stated enough. You have Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, Alabama. I would argue the most historic street in all of America because you have the Court Square Fountain, and that was the largest slave auction block in the entire country. Right across the street, you have the Winter Building. That's where the telegram was sent to fire the first shot of the Civil War at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. You move up Dexter Avenue, you have Martin Luther King Jr.'s Baptist church that he was pastor at. You have the bus boycott, the bus station about a block away from that. You have the How Long Not Long speech from Martin Luther King Jr. at the footsteps of the state capitol. And then so much history, so much blood was shed, so much was fought for on that one street. And then all in the period of a week, it was the same place where people were fighting for rights again, where rights that were fought for 65 years ago were being lost again. It's mind-blowing to me just how it's come back around and we're finding ourselves in this place again.
I think
there's a lot of gaslighting. I'm sorry.
No, you go first.
There's a lot of gaslighting around what you mentioned, right? This idea that, the Voting Rights Act is it's 60 years old. Why do we even need it anymore? John Roberts saying in Shelby v. Holder, the 2013 case that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And under Section 5, those states and municipalities that had a history of racism in voting had to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws through the Department of Justice, right? Roberts and the Roberts Court gutted that section in Shelby v. Holder. But in doing so, they said, don't worry about it, guys. You still have Section 2. And then here we are 13 years later, and they're gutting Section 2 and trying to make it seem like it is unreasonable for Black people to be so up in arms about being disenfranchised, about being stripped of power, because racism is over now, guys. You had a Black president, right? And it's just, I think that a lot of the country is really out of touch with what's going on in the South. You get a lot of like these New York liberals or West Coast liberals who say stuff like, oh, Alabama is just a flyover state. Why are you living in Alabama anyway? You should move out of Alabama. Alabama, as you said, is a historical place. It is where a lot of Black folks live. And trying to argue that these Black people should uproot their lives to go move to some other state is bananas in the first instance. And then you get places like Jess and I both live in Colorado. I saw a lot of people on social media saying, well, we just need to redistrict Colorado to make up for the fact that Southern Black people have been disenfranchised. And that doesn't really help Southern Black people, right? Because Democrats in Colorado do not have the same interests as Southern Black people in Alabama. And I made a joke on social media that there's like 16 Black people in Colorado, right? How me and my girlfriend and the other 14 Black people supposed to account for what is needed in Southern Black states? So it is not just a matter of moving deck chairs around on the Titanic. We have to re-enfranchise Southern Black people.
Yes.
And I'm really glad I let Imani go first, because what she said only makes my point even stronger. And that is, what she asked, what happened in the 13 years between Shelby County versus Holder and Louisiana versus Callais. And there was, in that time, an intentional effort to rewrite American history, to retcon reality. I'm talking about the fight over removing Confederate monuments and reinstating them. This entire national conversation around what the January 6th insurrection really was, and its roots of it in, that sort of defiance. Conservatives just largely had an open playing field to start with. And so then the fire hose effect takes place with this Trump administration. What's one of the first things that they do is start going after DEI initiatives. What is one of the first impacts of Elon Musk and doging our federal agencies is to throw out hundreds of thousands of Black women in particular from the federal workplace. Like this, there is a project of re-elevating a specific vision of whiteness and baking it into the constitutional amendments that came out of the civil rights or the Civil War and the civil rights movement, particularly like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, to change that so that they benefit white power. And I say that very specifically, white power as opposed to racial equality. And that's what's going on around efforts to rewrite the 14th Amendment, to, sort of elevate the Confederacy, for lack of a better frame. Like that is really, truly the heart of that project.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you look at some of the cases that are now being brought under these Reconstruction Amendments, 13, 14, 15, no slavery, equal protection, voting, right? And I keep saying, and I say on my podcast, Boom Lawyered, all the time, these amendments were Black ass amendments, right?
Yeah.
They were amendments that were intended to bring Black people into parity with white people.
Yes.
They were not colorblind amendments. They were not race neutral amendments. And you can look at, for example, Ketanji Brown Jackson, right, who is, doing originalism the right way, to kind of make fun of Ezra Klein, right? She's doing originalism by going back to 1868 and looking at what the drafters of the 14th Amendment were trying to do. They weren't trying to protect white voters from being redistricted, right? They were trying to protect Black voters. And so the fact that we lost the Voting Rights Act because white voters sued under the 14th Amendment is amazing to me. It's absolutely amazing to me. And we're going to see more of it, right? We're going to see more white people using the Equal Protection Clause to the detriment of Black people who were the intended beneficiaries of the Reconstruction Amendments. Now, I'm not saying that the 14th Amendment does not apply to white people. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that the way that the conservative legal movement is interpreting the 14th Amendment makes it such that it is going to be nearly impossible for Black people to bring equal protection claims and very easy for white people to bring them, right?
Yeah.
Because you have this whole crusade against DEI. And what is DEI? It's intentional discrimination, right? It's intentional discrimination. That's what the New York, the real estate, the guy who didn't get the real estate deputy editor job at the New York Times is claiming, right? The EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is suing on this white man's behalf, suing the New York Times because that white guy didn't get a promotion. And what is the evidence for the fact that he was discriminated against intentionally? The New York Times' DEI policy. Meanwhile, for Black people to sue, we have to find a legislator who said we don't want Black people to have representation, or to say, someone at the New York Times saying we don't want Black people to be editors. That's not the way racism works anymore. It's much more subtle than that because racists got smarter.
Yep. And you know what? I'm really happy that y'all brought up that 13-year period was a period of trying to rewrite American history, because I think it's really easy. And these are my final thoughts on this before we move into the closing question. So I'd love your final thoughts on it too before we round it out. But one thing that I try to talk to people a lot is in Alabama, you have people waking up, you have people getting involved for the first time, you have people realizing, oh, I don't have to vote the way I've been voting for my entire life. And for them, I feel like they're looking at things with this like really narrow point of view. And but what they're failing to see is that within the past like 20-ish years, Alabama went from having elected Democrats at the state level, it being a fairly purple state at the state legislature level, to being a Republican supermajority controlled state, and has been that way for decades. And then what you see from there, when you put things into context and the timeline of our history in the state and other states alike, is that Republicans are doing everything they can to expand that supermajority, because when a state has one party control, voters become apathetic. They become disengaged. They think, well, I can't do anything, which then hands even more power to the Republicans. And then you see where we are today. So I think it's really important to take what we're just talking about, but tie it into that entire timeline of, okay, we had Democrats elected before, but we are now in a Republican supermajority controlled state. And this is all by design to remove Democrats and people of color from power in the state, to really disenfranchise voters even further.
Agreed. And I would add just another layer of that is that in that movement, a shift happened within the conservative movement as well to really believe with their full chest that government is bad and needs to be broken. So that wasn't always part of the conservative thinking as well. It should be that government is limited. But what the conservative movement has done is sort of moved it into a place where the only people who can get elected are folks who think that the government should be bad and not working anyway. So that means that they don't deliver services that other Republicans in other time periods would have delivered to their constituents. So what do the constituents do? They say, well, nothing works around here anyway, so why bother participating? Like, it's really a deep campaign to bake apathy and to, voting is muscle memory. It takes work to vote in an off-cycle primary election in a random month, like what Alabama just had. People need to want to do that. And if you don't have the muscle memory of voting, because your experience with it is my people never win, when they do, they don't deliver, what's the point anyway? That is the secret sauce for having corruption stay in place.
110%. So I just want to ask y'all, and we'll go Imani and Jess, what is it that y'all aren't wrong about?
We are not wrong about the fact that there is nothing, and I mean nothing, progressive that will help actual people that Congress can pass that will survive this iteration of the Supreme Court. So I had someone say to me the other day, well, can't we do both? Can't we both fight for, abortion rights at the national level and court reform? We can do them at the same time. No, we can't. We have to do one first. We have to do court reform first.
Yep.
And if we don't, this is our future. This is what it's going to look like.
Jess, what about you? What are you not wrong about?
we are also not wrong about the fact that community and joy are two of the most powerful antidotes to authoritarianism in this particular moment. So dig into your communities, love and know your neighbors, and find joy in the moments as you can, because authoritarians hate joy and they hate neighbors knowing each other and looking out for each other.
I'm so happy that you said that, because every episode it comes back to this towards the end, unprompted, the importance of community and the importance of local community, especially with everything we talked about in this episode. They're throwing so much at us. There's so much happening at that national level, but the one thing that this fascist regime, the authoritarians, that they can't control is what we do at the local community level, and we have a real opportunity to make an impact with the people who are in our nuclear circles and our local communities all across the country. And if we all can focus on our local community, then change can happen that way as well. And I'm hopeful that people are starting to really get more involved in their local communities. I know here in Birmingham, Alabama, I've seen in the younger generations this influx of new volunteers and nonprofits and people getting involved, and that gives me hope. And I hope people can continue to do that. Thank you to both of you so much for your time today. I really appreciate y'all's expertise and knowledge in breaking down everything that's been happening with the Supreme Court recently. I cannot say thank you enough.
It was our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, and roll Tide.
Oh no,
Tide.
War Eagle. I have both of my degrees from Auburn, so I'm kind of
Oh,
so no roll
that's
Tide.
an actual like rivalry I just hit there too. Apologies.
Yes. No, you're fine. Until I get the student loans paid off, I'm like financially forced to say War Eagle for the time being. So
amazing. Well, thank you so
both.
much for the invitation and for having us on. This was great.
Yes, it was really
Absolutely.
fun talking to you.
Thank you.
All right.